Last month, I made a video revamping DK Pass from Mario Kart DS. It was an interesting follow-up project to my first video like this, where I updated Luigi's circuit from Mario Kart Wii. DK Pass ended up being very straightforward once I got a hold of a track model from Mario Kart Tour, which actually gave me time to mod the track into the game. It looked pretty bad in-game and was very glitchy, but I was happy to be playing this track in Mario Kart 8. And amazingly, just after I put the video out, somebody actually got it working and looking like an actual track. Huge thanks to Airmate on Twitter for making this. I'll have his Twitter and YouTube linked in the description. It couldn't have been entirely easy to work with what I provided, considering I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to modding Mario Kart 8. And with Toad's Factory, oh boy. My prayers go out to anybody who decides to try and do something with the track mod I've created in this video. So why Toad's Factory? Well, it's quite a legendary Mario Kart track that, for some reason, Nintendo refuses to update. And, well, after sizing this project up, I sort of understand why. This is probably the most technical track in Mario Kart Wii. This project has all of the satisfying but tedious intricacy of both previous revamp projects combined. And for that reason, I'm deciding to slow down and show the whole process. I think there are lots of moments that are worth talking about, and I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So, here's how it all began. After exploring the model of Toad's Factory on noclip.website, I was both excited by the many opportunities for improvement and horrifically overwhelmed by the amount of moving parts that would be, at very least, challenging to implement in Blender, and downright impossible for me to get working in the playable version of the track. I was really on the fence about the whole thing, leaning more towards picking a different track that would be a little more straightforward. But what fun is downloading a Mario Kart Tour track and putting a few textures on it? Toad's Factory desperately needs an update, and I'd be honored to give it a shot. But I would need to make a few things clear before I continue. I'm not here to present a high-quality mod of Toad's Factory in Mario Kart 8. That's just not something I'm nearly ready to do. I'm here to present a high-quality rendition of Toad's Factory. Well, a rendition of Toad's Factory. My goal is to give the design, the soul of this track, a chance to live alongside the wonderful tracks of today, even if only in the form of a handful of renders. In short, this track mod is gonna suck big time. I started off by just getting the original track set up in Blender before doing any updating. I plugged in all of the alpha maps on textures that have transparency, like fences. Then I set the alpha mode to alpha clip, so that anywhere on the texture with an alpha value of 0 is made transparent. I also imported the first set of conveyor belts. You can see they need to be scaled down, because I scaled the rest of the model down at the beginning. Luckily, I scaled the model down specifically to 20%, so anything that's to scale that I import, like these conveyor belts, I can type S to modify the scale, then type 0.2 to set it to 20% of its size. Now I've just got to carefully line it up with the hole in the floor. I'll get these animated and everything later. For now, I'm gonna focus on getting the most simple and impactful things replaced. Also, I don't feel like doing the other conveyor belts, so I'll just do those when I get to them. Now I can't just start replacing things. There's just too much to work at. I'll get overwhelmed without defined sections and milestones. So I broke the main track into 4 sections. First is the outside area with the dirt and mud. Then section 2, the first inside section with this right turn and the room with the item box maker things that try to kill you. Then the third section, outside again. This time over the water on more conveyor belts and some crane hoisted moving platforms. Then back inside to section 4, where you take this right curve into another conveyor room that curves left, then another right curve that leads back outside to section 1. Each section brings its own challenges. The first will take the longest, since I'll be making a lot of the new textures that other sections will reuse. But the other sections have got some very interesting facets, like working pistons, item box makers, and moving platforms. Again, remember, I'm not getting this stuff working in the actual game. That's a completely different process to getting it working in Blender. I wish there was a play button at the top of Blender that opens Mario Kart 8 and does all of the modding for me, but as of 2024, they haven't got that yet. Not that this stuff is impossible, I'm just incompetent when it comes to Mario Kart 8 modding. Now I've got a structured plan to follow, entries on a list to check off, a sense of progression to get me through this industrial overhaul, and the first step is to update the texture of the dirt road. This is sort of like the foundation for section 1, and it just so happens that the dirt road texture is also part of the regular road texture, so I'll update both of those at once. I found a perfect dirt road in Mario Kart 8's Wario Stadium, and I used the good old basic road texture from Mario Kart Stadium. Then I carefully combined them in such a way that the edges of the 2 road patterns meet where they did on the original texture, and the dirt road texture splits down the middle on either side. I've also got to make a black and yellow hazard pattern on either side of the road. Not only does this help the road fit in its environment, but this section of this texture is reused all over the track. I'm sure there is a way to do a pattern like this in Photoshop or maybe Adobe Illustrate without creating a rectangle, rotating it 45 degrees and duplicating it a million times, then cutting a rectangle out of that. But I don't know what the other simple method is. So I did everything the probably wrong way that would probably still work, but would most definitely suck to do. Before applying the texture, I tried simplifying the track a bit by joining the geometry into one model, but for some reason the textures would all mess up. After a little troubleshooting, it turns out each of these separate models have a UV map, and they all have different names. So I had to rename each of the UV maps to the same thing, so that they were joined rather than destroyed when I joined the geometry. And what do you know, it looks pretty nice, but it's hard to tell without updating some more textures. I updated the next texture in a pretty similar way. I got some grass from Mario Circuit and combined it with a rock wall from N64 Toad's Turnpike to create a new cliff texture. I also created a separate texture that has a dirt spillover rather than grass for these cliff faces that sit on the edge of the dirt road texture. I wanted to keep updating things centered around the dirt road that I had initially updated, so I next started to tackle the signs that sit alongside the road in Section 1. This was a case where looking around for a replacement texture in Mario Kart 8 wasn't the solution. I instead would have to recreate these signs from scratch in Photoshop. So I carried on creating shapes and putting effects on them until eventually I got something decent looking for this first sign. Then I moved on to the bottom sign, where I ended up having to draw a little hook going through the A, and even download an image of a gear and turn it into a silhouette by doing a solid color overlay. This new sign texture brings Toad's Factory one step closer to where it needs to be. Another trackside detail that needs updating is this fence texture. This was a pretty boring update. I just created something that looked like a metal bar and duplicated it over and over until it looked like a fence. But it looks a good bit better, especially with the normal map. In case you feel like generating and applying your own normal map, here's how it's done in Photoshop. Once you have your image that you want to make a normal map for, go to Filters, 3D, and generate normal map. Honestly, you don't need to mess with these settings too much, but they will help you get different results. You may want to blur it a bit to give it a smoother look, or you may need to invert it if Photoshop misinterpreted your image. After exporting the image from Photoshop, go to Blender and go over to the shader editor, which you can open up in any window up here. Then press Shift A and type Image Texture. Now you can find your normal map you want to use and set it to non-color rather than sRGB. Now it won't work just like this, so drag the color node off and type Normal Map Color. This way it plugs this node into the color socket. Or you can just type Normal Map C if you want to save some time. And if you really want to save some serious milliseconds, you can get it all the way down to NORC. Now you can go ahead and plug this into the normal socket on your texture and mess with the strength as needed. And boom, your flat fence texture looks a little fancier. Or a much better example of the power of a normal map, the mud and water. Those are next. And while getting good looking water can sound scary, it's one of the easiest things I'll do this whole project. First, I find a normal map for water from Mario Kart 8. Then I apply it to my Toad's Factory water material. Now I just need to mess with the material settings a bit, and there you go. A simple color material looks like water. I did the same thing for the mud, but then realized that the water was looking a bit too viscous, so I lowered the strength of the normal map a good bit, which made it look much better. The dash panels were next, and they were, for once, just a simple texture swap with minimal UV work. These crates, however, managed to require UV work before I even touched them. But after I got them properly unwrapped, I realized just how good this texture was for a Wii game. So I generated a normal map and cranked the metallic up a bit, and wow, that's crazy. Without even replacing the texture, these crates look better than anything else I've updated so far. Before updating anything else on the ground, I decided to work on the two textures that make up the exterior of the factory, starting with this blue scrap metal texture. Again, this isn't something that's going to have a good analog in Mario Kart 8, so I'm gonna have to recreate the texture from scratch. But now that it's finished, it looks better, but something's still missing. It's too clean. Like, there's no weathering or imperfection. I tried a few different methods, but ultimately just moved on to the bronze/gold texture. This one was much simpler, so I decided to try and figure out how to give it some rust or something. And after looking around a little, I found something really great online. Apparently, you can get a good metal imperfection look if you generate some clouds and apply this unsharpen effect. After working that technique into the texture and generating a normal map, we get a much more realistic and interesting looking metal texture. I also did this to the scrap metal texture, and with with a little UV work, this building's looking pretty nice. But let's get back to the ground details, starting with the bleachers. I've replaced these previously in Luigi's Circuit, so I'll just jump over there and take a segment of those. Then I can retexture it using some of the Toad's Factory textures I've created so far. Now we're starting to get close to finishing the textures for Section 1. There's still a few models that I've got to replace, and by this point, I still had no clue how I was going to do so. But for now, let's just get some textures replaced. Like the start gate. I really like this cool metal design that holds up the sign, so I'll keep that and just make the texture look a little bit better. The actual sign, however, ended up being a much more interesting task. I want to create a unique sign that fits the track, so it's going to need to be made from scratch. After reusing a few patterns and messing with some shapes and some Toad images that I had, I've got a pretty cool looking start gate. I spent the next hour tweaking the UV maps of the bronze and steel textures on this gate. If I had to guess, I'd say half of this project looked like this, fixing any areas where a texture doesn't quite line up with another, or anywhere where it's a little stretched. My only guess as to why this happens is that my texture has got more fine details that rely on the entire texture being displayed in the original aspect ratio. For example, these screws on the bronze texture look pretty screwed up when they get stretched. They've got a level of detail that just can't be compromised by bad UV unwrapping. But these blurry Wii textures look like garbage whether you maintain the original ratio or not. The lower quality a texture is, the bigger role the base color of the texture is taking on. So it becomes excusable that this bronze texture's details are a bit off in some areas, because the wall is still that orangish color. And I should say, while we're on the subject of UV maps, UV doesn't stand for ultraviolet. It actually stands for UV, as in UVW, as in XYZ. I'm sure this is starting to make a lot of sense. See, geometry in 3D space uses X, Y, and Z as its axes by which it can be transformed, translated, or rotated, but textures use the previous 3 letters in the alphabet, U, V, and W. UV maps, however, don't utilize W, since they're 2D, like how a 2D graph doesn't use Z, it only uses X and Y. Hopefully that clears things up a little bit. Okay, that's enough Khan Academy. Let's get back to the project. After a little tweaking the start gate, I set out to find a replacement for one of Section 1's models, the bulldozers. This is something that nearly scared me away from doing the whole project, but I knew that there had to be something somewhere on the model's resource. As I perused through the random countless 3D models, I also had my eye out for a crane, which is something else I've got to replace in Section 1. Unfortunately, I never did find a bulldozer that would work, but I did find something else. In Excitebike Arena, we've got these big vehicles, which, with a little bit of imagination, could possibly be a viable replacement. At first I planned on somehow turning this vehicle into a bulldozer, but then I realized that that wasn't necessary. Also, mostly that would be really hard. But think about it. These vehicles can sit here and act as moving obstacles just like the bulldozers did. I could even put some crates on top of them and they'll fit right into this scene. I also used that cool metal weathering trick on the texture and normal map and got it looking a little bit better. I'm still not entirely sure what to do for the cranes, but I do have an idea for the towers on the factory exterior. Assuming the geometry is somewhat compatible, I should be able to use the towers from Mario Kart 8's Bowser's Castle. And after removing some spikes and working on the texture a bit, this is a huge improvement. Just looking at the entrance to Toad's Factory, I'm starting to feel that Toad's Factory spirit welling into the track again. So, with a stronger sense of purpose, I journeyed back into the thickets of the model's resource in search of a crane. And I found one. On the back of a boat in Splatoon 2, there's a decently high quality crane. The proportions are a bit off, and the texture is gonna need some help, but I think this will work. First, I opened the boat in a new Blender project and slowly separated the crane. Then I brought the crane into Toad's Factory and began reshaping it a bit. I want the body section of the crane to be more prominent. Then I spent a while getting the texture just right, adding some details like a Morton's Construction logo. I'd be lying if I said this is as good as it gets, but I think this crane does a good enough job to at least blend in with the final product. It just needs to work as a peripheral reinforcement. Speaking of which, I should get to replacing some of the surrounding foliage. In previous projects, I wasn't able to find Mario Kart 8 trees for some reason, but this time I found just what I needed in Moo Moo Meadows. A couple different colored trees and bushes will make this hillside look like it's straight out of Mario Kart 8. After doing that, I brought in an HDR and a skybox and set up some daytime daytime lighting. Before, I was looking at things with nighttime lighting, because it was better for viewing normal map details. Plus, it's a bit more generous, since the not-so-good details get cast into darkness. But now that I'm finishing the section up, I've got to see what everything really looks like. And that's section 1. I'll be coming back here occasionally to make adjustments and whatnot, but now it's time to move on to section 2. This section will be defined by studying and recreating mechanical moving parts and strange machines. And of course, lots and lots of UV adjusting. By the end of the project, I will look back on this section with the biggest sense of growth and accomplishment. It all started the way it did outside in section 1. Replace the most common and essential texture, this blue metal. I've already replaced this road in section 1. I've already replaced the bronze texture, which half of these gears reuse, but this metal texture is something that I haven't even touched. This was a pretty typical manual replacement that ended up yielding really nice results. My next hour was spent unwrapping gears, putting the steel texture on these rods, putting the steel texture on the floor, and replacing these big steel bolts that run through the entrance to section 2. The last texture I've got to update in this room is this steel scaffolding. I ended up making this in Photoshop out of parts of the steel texture. Now I can work on the conveyor belts in section 2. These didn't get a whole lot of updating, but after putting a UV warp modifier on them, they look pretty good. That should be all of the textures. Now I've got to start replacing some models. Let's first go with something simple, the lights. I looked around on noclip.website for a suitable replacement, and found exactly what I was looking for in Shy Guy Falls. So I deleted whatever the heck was going on with the previous lights, and got the new ones all retextured and set up. Now, this room has got some of that character that I felt with the finished entrance. Next was something that I feared perhaps more than even the bulldozers. The replacement of the functioning pistons alongside the track in the second room. I don't have much knowledge on piston setups, so it took a little bit of studying for me to understand what was happening here. But I've come to the conclusion that there are 4 basic components to this system. First is the top of the piston, which I know is pushed up and down by the pressure of explosions happening above. Then is the second part, the bottom of the piston, which is capable of rotational motion left and right centered at the top, like a pendulum. Then is the third part, the spinning thing. This is connected near its top to the bottom of the piston, and is spun 360 degrees every up and down cycle of the piston, as it's pushed and pulled by the circular pendulum motion of the bottom of the piston. This in turn rotates the rod, which is the fourth and final part. This is the goal of the system, to spin the rod. It converts the up and down motion of the piston into a rotational motion in the rod. Now don't go building any cars with that explanation. My engineering experience is limited exclusively to looking at Toad's factory from Mario Kart Wii, but luckily, it was enough. I started with the rod, which was obviously very simple. Then I created the spinning thing out of a cube. It's pretty crazy the shapes you can make with a cube and a few keybinds. Control R, while in edit mode, will let you make a loop cut. E lets you extrude faces, and Control B lets you bevel a corner to smooth it out. Then I lets you inset a face within another face. With these basic tools, you can turn a cube into just about anything. And when a cube doesn't work, a cylinder or a sphere usually will. It's worth noting, however, that a cube will always work, because you can turn a cube into a cylinder or a sphere. The top piston was made from a cylinder, which was scaled down vertically, loop cut, extruded, and beveled a bit. Then I did a couple Boolean modifiers on it as well, which lets you remove a shape from whatever the modifier is on, to get the hole and the flat edges on the sides of the otherwise cylindrical shape. In the case of the bottom piston, a cube worked perfectly. Then I got some textures going, and began the intimidating process of animating. Fortunately, I had separated the motion that each part of this system performs. The top of the piston moves strictly up and down. The bottom moves up and down as well as swinging left to right, and both the spinning things and the rod rotate along their front face's normal axis. The next 55 minutes was a bunch of tedious keyframe math and contending with Blender's quirky animating system. There were a few times when something was acting weird and I had to apply transforms, which I guess just fixes stuff sometimes. But by the end of the whole thing, I had this. Something very close to the original piston setup, and it was ready to be put in an armature and moved to room 2 of section 2. I ended up having to adjust this thing that houses the pistons, since my setup isn't exactly the same proportions as the original. I also recolored the tops of the pistons to be bronze, which I think looks better, but I felt like the pistons were a little bit slow. This is about how fast they move in the original track, but I'd like to see them going a bit faster and a bit smoother, so I cranked up the frame rate of the project from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. I really like that. It's gonna make my animation smoother, but there is a downside. Now, to get the same length render, I'm going to need to render twice as many frames. Where in 30 FPS, a 240 frame animation would come out to 8 seconds long, it'll only be 4 seconds in 60 FPS. And with each frame of the final project taking about 11 seconds to render, yeah, that's some long render times. But I'll manage that later. It's worth the long render times for smoother renders. After setting up a little bit of lighting, I moved on to the item box maker. This was a lot simpler than the Pistons, but still took a little over an hour. And here it is. In order for it to fit properly in this room, I've got to make this metal piece taller. And that's pretty much it for section 2. There was just so much that I loved about that section. From understanding to modeling to animating the pistons, the puzzles I solved to create the item box maker, this was my favorite section of this project. In other words, it's all downhill from here. Next is section 3. This should be the easiest, as it has the least amount of replacements. As far as textures go, all I've got to do is fix the UVs on the crates. The hardest part will be recreating the moving road segments. So I began with the crates, and after getting them fixed, I decided to give them the colors that they have in the original track. I also noticed that the original track has a blue tinted road, which fits the color scheme a bit more, so I did the same to mine. Then I went ahead and took on that moving road section. I started by selecting the base road segment here, duplicating it, and separating it from the rest of the track. Then I resized it a bit and had to adjust the UV map as a consequence. Then I created a cube at the corner, made it taller, and put that hazard pattern on it. Now I've just got to create that metal loop at the top. For that, I used a cylinder and a torus, both with the steel texture. Then I duplicated this piece to the other corners. After that, I made a cube with the hazard pattern to sit up in this scaffolding, and took the hook from one of the cranes and attached it to the bottom. Then I attached the loops to the hook with rope, which are just cylinders using a rope texture from Hyrule Circuit. The connection point that looks like rope wound around the hook is actually just a wide torus with the rope texture on it. Now, hopefully the other moving platform is the exact same dimensions as this one, so we won't have to rescale anything. Nice. Alright, now for the easy model replacements. First, I swapped out these couple of towers that had yet to be updated. Then I brought in the conveyor belts and set them up the same as the others. It was at this moment that I realized that in section 2 I had made a mistake. There are actually supposed to be 6 item box makers, not just 2 in the middle. So I fixed that up and decided it was a good time to get a render here, in case I want to include it in a community post or something like that. I gave the pistons a little bit of motion blur by turning motion blur on and setting the shutter to 1. I also cheated just a little and emphasized it in Photoshop with the motion blur effect. Now that I'm all finished with section 3, it's time to see what's in store for me in the final section. This was mostly going to be easy, just a few texture replacements and a conveyor belt. It may even be easier than section 3, but it was the fact that I was nearing the end of the 4 sections that made me concerned. Along the course of this project, there was a sort of rising tension about what I might add after the 4 sections were complete, but that's not important now. Let's just focus on the final section. The first thing I did was replace the floor in room 1 with the steel texture. This floor should hardly ever be seen, but it shouldn't look super glitchy if it is. I also wanted to give this weird circle thing more life, more of a purpose, so I put a plane in it and gave it a zoomed in portion of the emissive dashpad texture. Then I put an area light to add an orange glow. Now we've got some kind of scary lava cauldron thing that gives this room some interesting lighting and a little more character. Next is room 2 of 3. I started off with the curved conveyor belt, which ended up being really tough to get into place without having gaps in areas. But eventually I had it set up all nice, with about 1,000 area lights just to keep those renders from happening too quickly. I also set up the actual lights that go over the track in this room. The rest of this section was almost entirely UV stuff, so I'll spare you all that. I was now officially finished with all 4 sections I had set out to revamp. It felt pretty good, considering I wasn't even sure I was going to make it to the end of the first section. But still, there was plenty of touching up and some little additions that I hadn't gotten around to yet. I started by putting the new steel texture on these big key things. I also animated them so that they slowly turn. Then I did some more fun animating within the factory walls. I started in section 1, selecting and separating gears and setting their origin points to their geometry so that they rotate around their center, not wherever the center of the track is. And after animating them, I think they really add a lot to this room. The other gears are in room 2 of section 4, and these were even more fun to animate. It was the same process, but the way the motion of the gears and the conveyor belts interact in this room is really cool. I'm sure these gears will look even better when they're moving in the room's actual lighting. but previewing the animation in rendered mode is extremely slow right now, and only gets a single sample per frame rather than 64. So we'll just have to wait until some actual renders are finished to see what these rooms really look like. Next are details outside of the factory. I can't stand this Gmod looking surrounding terrain, so I brought in some of the surrounding details from my Luigi Circuit revamp and got them looking pretty decent. I also filled out the foliage a bit more and spread some 2D foliage in the distance, and I made sure to give the water some surrounding details as well. I went ahead and stole the islands from the distance of Toad's Harbor and set those up here, which work perfectly. Then I finished up those vehicles in the mud. I animated them the way that I'd imagine they'd work in the game, and put some crates on top of them. And finally, I headed into Mario Kart 8's Bowser's Castle and took some of the pipes to fill in some of the empty looking areas inside Toad's factory. Now I can set up some renders and make a community post using that image we made earlier. As far as the modding goes, things went along somewhat smoothly. I started by saving my Blender project as a new file, since I want to save this version how it is now for doing renders. But now that I've got this version, I can go around deleting anything that won't be exported in the final FBX. Now that I've got lights and animations deleted, I can start separating geometry by their textures. Basically, I want everything that uses a material to be separated as its own object, which means using select material in edit mode, then using P to separate that section. Then I've got to get rid of all the other unused materials on that object. For DK Pass, I actually sat there and clicked this minus button until I had gotten rid of all of them. But this time around, I noticed this little button here, which removes all unused materials. After grieving that unnecessary loss of my time while porting DK Pass, I pushed onward separating materials until there was one object for each material. Then I exported that as an FBX and brought it into Track Studio. Here I'm gonna have to import and set up all my textures. This is pretty tedious, since you've got to make sure that the base textures, normal map textures, specular textures, and emission textures are set up slightly different. Now that the textures are mostly working, I can make the lap path. This isn't a fun process. It's a bunch of messing with transforms on planes and hoping that it results in a functional track. These planes connect from one to the next to create a sort of tunnel. Anything outside this tunnel is considered out of the track boundaries. This is also how you create checkpoints to make sure the player doesn't skip any sections. I also created the collision map in Blender. First, I got rid of anything that the player would never collide with. Then I made everything that should act metal have the same material. As with everything that should act like a normal road, or a dirt road, or a cliffside, or a dash pad. Then I exported that as an FBX again and imported it into Track Studio, messing with how each material should act in-game. And the result of this work?
Come on.
A one-way ticket to my desktop. Eventually, I found out the issue was the lap path. Remember how I said the planes connect from one to the next? Well, these two don't. So I fixed that, and gave it another go. And here it is. It exists. Why didn't you play it? Where's the gameplay? The track is obviously a little bit giant, and there's a massive hole in the floor where the conveyor belt didn't line up because I had to re-import it because the UV map was deleted when I joined it to everything else. Also, the lighting sucks and gets all weird sometimes, and you can't quite make this jump, and nothing moves, and the dirt is all slidey because I made it off-road for some reason, and you can do a donut on the track because it's too wide. I'm not happy with this, but I'm also not happy with uploading once a month. So I'm gonna let this be as it is. Once again, if anybody feels like making this look any better, good luck. Or if you want to use this model for anything else, you don't need my permission, feel free. I'll have the files linked in the description. If you do make an improvement on this, let me know on YouTube or Twitter or wherever, and I'll do my best to retweet or share what you make and show your work in my next entry in the series. And it looks like the renders are done. Here's how they turned out. Well, that's gonna do it. Hopefully you learned something useful, or just enjoyed watching me work away at making a Mario Kart Wii track look marginally better. I'm not entirely sure where this series will go at the moment. On one hand, I know I've got subscribers that would like to see something else at some point, and I'd really like to upload more frequently again. But on the other hand, I don't have any ideas for anything else, and people seem to enjoy these videos. So I guess I'll just leave you hanging, uncertain of what or when I may upload next, which I think is exactly what you're not supposed to do if you want a successful YouTube channel. I'm gonna spend some time just planning out some things that I want to do this year. Just with this series, I've really realized how much I love working in Blender for videos. So I'd like to try and do things that allow me to, at very least, interject some form of 3D modeling or photoshopping or something like that. I don't really do well with videos that just consist of playing a game, scripting, and editing. So I'll probably make some kind of a return to the Super Mario 64 DS Theories series, doing some fun Blender stuff the way I did in the HMC episode. I'll probably do something outside of this series for my next few videos. Something that can be accomplished within a week, but still feels as enjoyable as these. I'd hate to burn out on this series so soon. There's a lot of tracks left to update. Anyways, that's it for this year's first video. I'll see you later. Thanks.